Welcome back, everybody. And I should tell you what the Atlantic Council has tweeted this morning, and we're back. So day 2. And what we want to do over the next 15 minutes, Ines and I, is bring in some other voices to hear your reflections. We'll be hearing from the Assistant Secretary General in a moment. But for those of you who haven't read the 79 paragraphs of the communique yesterday, let me underscore paragraph 2. We face a dangerous, unpredictable and fluid security environment with enduring challenges and threats from all strategic directions. So that's the context. But remember, this is about NATO engaging, and that's why you're here. We want to hear from some other voices in a moment. Remember what we heard from Katarina from Warsaw yesterday. You're all being too proper. The atmosphere was too much politically correct. So let's hear some other voices, Ines.
Yes, we want to bring in some folks, don't we?
Yes, indeed.
Where are they?
I want to talk to the Atlantic Council, 3 or 4 from the Atlantic Council, because you're here on a leadership trip. You've been in the Balkans, you've been elsewhere. One of you, please.
Would you join us here on stage? Would be lovely. So all 3 of you, it would be great.
I did warn you I was going to come to you. So it's not a surprise.
Thank you very much. This is your applause.
Just give us your view of how this is going, Lauren.
Okay. Just to kind of extend that. So I'm a journalist. I've been covering the Middle East for the past 8 years or so. A little bit of Africa as well. I guess for me, this is a great opportunity to come together and talk to interesting policymakers and whatnot. But to be honest, whenever I am at conferences like this, I can't help but to feel that it's just a little bit out of touch.
So we've got to get more in touch. Priyal.
You know, the first session yesterday was really great. I think everybody wanted to see a little bit more as the people just got up and were getting closer and closer and getting into the debate. I thought that was great. There was a lot of sparring. I felt like the sparring was missing from the other sessions. I wish there was a little bit more of that. In some of the sessions, I felt like everybody is pretty much articulating the same points, which are very crucial points, but I wish there were other sides.
So which points are you missing?
For example, when we were talking about inclusiveness and diversity in that session, it was great, but inclusiveness and diversity is not just about women. It should have been about sexual orientation. It should have been about race, about religion. Why did we miss out on those issues?
Okay. Do you agree with that? I see some nodding heads.
All right.
Okay, so we keep that in mind. So diversity is more than just gender equality. Good point.
And can we get a microphone to Pete from Indiana as well, please?
All right. Hi guys, my name is Rainer Sturfeld. I'm from Estonia. I'm an entrepreneur in California right now and always participated in public life in parallel. And what I feel that my takeaway from yesterday was that, you know, tough times like this bring us together, and I really actually like that we're gonna have to, you know, come together and make some decisions and become better as an organization. It's like a relationship. You go through tough times, you revisit your values, you revisit your commitments, and, you know, yes, you will have some rubbing here and there, but I think that we would need actually even a little bit more of that just to shake things loose a little bit. So,
all right, so we've got to keep shaking. Got to keep shaking.
Getting in touch, being more diverse, and gonna keep shaking.
That's a message to all the participants and the moderators. Pete C.
Thank you very much
Indiana.
indeed. Thank you very much.
Pete C. from Indiana. Stay up there.
Okay. Good morning, and thank you to both of you for bringing some different voices to the table. This is much appreciated. My name is Pete Seat from the United States, from the great state of Indiana. And the 2 things I would share first, I was very struck by the message about not being proper and being less politically correct. And I think that's extremely important when we go back to our communities, to our member nations, to share this story. But I think the real point there is we have to be more than just public facing, as this event is, and we need to be publicly engaged. This can't just be a 2-day session of talking and sharing these stories with people who already agree with one another. We need to do it back in our homes and back with the people that we live with each and every day. And the second point I would make is just how encouraged I've been seeing all the young dynamic leaders who have shared this stage over the past 24 hours. The Prime Minister of Canada, the Prime Minister of Macedonia, we'll be hearing from the Prime Minister of Iceland here in a few minutes. All young, dynamic leaders who are at the helm, bringing change to this world, and seeing all the young people in this room too leaves me very, very hopeful about the future.
Thanks, Pete. Anyone else want to come in? We're going to remain dynamic, please. Down here, microphone here. We've got about 3 or 4 minutes. There first and here next. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Florin Luca. I'm from Romania. And I want to share with you 2 ideas. First of all, concerning the values. We discussed yesterday a lot about the values, and I think it's a very important topic. I spent more than 20 years of my life in interfering with many cultures within 50 countries in the world. And one of the best idea that I've learned that values is not what we declare. It's not what we want. It's what we do every day in our actions.
And your second idea?
And the second idea that we want to share with you, it's about technology. And technology we discussed a lot yesterday. And here the key question is, how can we use technology in order to develop and to defend our most important value, which is freedom?
What we want to know is how many of you are going to go home and have a barbecue for NATO when you get home, in the spirit of Christian Friedland, please.
Hi, good morning. I'm Roger Hilton here, Secretary General of the Youth Atlantic Treaty Association. And the 2 major takeaways for us as an organization yesterday was, number 1, unity and the ability to transform are the 2 things that will keep NATO together. Through the demos, what's very important for us is that we all didn't agree, and that these disagreements were sometimes hostile and a little bit violent, but that was okay. But I think we're all sitting a little bit at the top of our ivory tower a little bit, because while we're all political junkies and we're addicted to these types of high-end articles, we need to be able to attract people who are outside of the bubble, chemists, farmers and stuff, but we need to make the point to them, why is it important for them to be invested in transatlantic values?
We'll be pushing that in a moment. And
you really get out to the real world. I mean, that's, I think, what many people said, right? Just don't keep it only here in this bubble, but kind of spread the news.
Hi everyone, I'm Tamara from Georgia. First of all, I want to congratulate you. It was a wonderful event. Everything started from the app, ending with the setting. It was beautiful, it was very engaging. I myself felt very engaged. I'm from Georgia, and it's very important for me to voice my country's concerns here, so it's been a tremendous opportunity for me to be here. And I want to make one more remark about the event and organizational stuff, maybe. I just wanted to say that I myself felt that the day was too long and sessions were too many. I feel that if you keep shorter, because I myself lost my concentration after the first half. We came here at 7 a.m., we left at 10. I left at 10.
So hey, but many memories you will take home.
Yes, it's maybe just my preference. I kind of prefer quality over quantity, so I think that shorter sessions, or longer sessions, but fewer sessions will be better.
All right, well, Ines and I will try and keep you awake later in the day.
We try doing that. We have to stop here now because I want to have a few words with Ambassador Tacan Ildem. Very warm welcome. Thank you for making time this very early morning, sir. So, which soccer team shall win, Mr. Ambassador? Are you allowed to say something about that?
Whoever wins, NATO will win.
That's a good point. Fair enough. So we are seeing the big event, the big summit there, and this event here. Which matters more?
Well, I think they both complement each other. We have a very important summit meeting. All summit meetings of NATO are important. And as we all could see, the deliverables are there. It shows that with the complex security environment that we are in, NATO is dealing with all the challenges that we face. And we deliver. The decisions that our leaders made are solid, and it conveys a very strong message that we are united, resolved, and take all the challenges as needed.
And how do we get this message out?
Well, this brings us to the second component, this excellent forum of discussion, NATO Engages, and I would like to take this opportunity to express my personal gratitude to all of our partners in the think tank consortium that my division, Public Diplomacy Division, partnered with. It is a great opportunity to have you all here, and I'm gratified to see a young audience, young leaders, many women in the audience. You are the multipliers of the good story that we need to communicate to our publics. And I fully agree with those who express the necessity for us to engage more with our publics. We, as NATO, bring 29 democratic countries, 30 soon to be, and it is the responsibility of democratically elected governments to inform publics about security and foreign policy issues, to create a good debate, and I think as members of NATO, to put NATO into the discussion. And here, for the 2 days of discussion, the second day today will yet be another good opportunity to exchange views about critical issues that we want to address. We will then go back to our homes to communicate what we have been discussing here, because there is lack of knowledge in our publics, and we cannot just take it for granted that there is a solid public support to NATO. We have to explain it.
So what I understand is that kind of that all of us are ambassadors after these 2 days to bring the idea of NATO back home to our countries, yes. Maybe with a barbecue recipe, yes, maybe with something else.
Yes. And my division will be always ready, available at the disposal of all to engage, and we can build a stronger teamwork. This is what we need.
Thank you very much.
Will you have a barbecue subdivision, Tacan?
Yes, yes, of course.
We will hear more of you at the final session, so to speak, in a wrap-up with Nick. So thank you very much, and I think we're all excited about this day. Yeah. Let's get started. Let's be critical with each other. Let's be smart, and let's have fun. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the President of Women in International Security, Brussels, Ms. Corinna Hörst.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us this morning in a fireside chat. And I think we need the fire because it has been rather cold in this tent. This morning we have a conversation with a very unusual NATO member. It's a member that doesn't have a standing army. It is up high north, surrounded by water, which leads to some interest among other global players, Russia and China. It is also a country that is led by somebody who is very skeptical about NATO, but is part of a coalition government, so needs to make compromises. So please allow me and join me in welcoming the Prime Minister from Iceland, Katrin Jakobsdottir. As we have learned sort of yesterday, there are many ways of how we can take a look at security and NATO. And for the Icelandic Prime Minister, it's the first NATO summit that you've joined. Why don't you share with us briefly sort of your takeaways and how has it been?
Well, it's been quite an interesting experience, actually, to come here to my first NATO summit. As you mentioned, I come from a party which is very skeptical about the membership of NATO, but in Iceland we have also a great parliamentary majority for the membership of NATO. We have a national security policy. So what the message I've been trying to bring over here at this summit, because all of these people here are, of course, people we are working very closely with, is really that we need to think about security in a broad manner. We need to think about security and how we can prevent conflict, not only stop conflict when it has already happened. And then we need to think about climate change. Then we need to think about cyber defenses. Then we need to think about social instabilities and social equality. So I think, for example, I said yesterday, Iceland has been increasing its spending on defense, like all other NATO nations, without having any military, obviously. So we have a little special position. But it's also important to think about development aid, humanitarian aid, and think of that as an investment in global security. And that's really our take on it in Iceland, how we can make the world a more peaceful and secure place and do it from a broad view.
Yeah. So let's take a seat and talk a little bit about multilateralism. Obviously, NATO is a multilateralism organization. You know, shared values, cooperation, pooling of resources. There's another institution, the UN, which in 2015 came forward with its Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 of us, and it really has been a signal about looking at issues and problems differently in a holistic manner and sort of looking at sort of solutions. I'd be interested in your take. Are there some lessons learned about the Sustainable Development Goals that are maybe useful for NATO to look at and take on as it's in its sort of future work?
Well, I think, you know, we have a clash of ideas here, because a lot of people say NATO is just the military or defense alliance, and NATO shouldn't be thinking about SDGs. NATO shouldn't be thinking about what the UN is doing. But when you sit at a summit, like I did yesterday for the first time, these are all the same people that are also going to the UN summits. A lot of these people are also meeting at the EU summits. So what we need to think about is that the things we are doing here don't clash with the things that we are doing there. So I think it's very important for NATO to think about the SDGs. What the NATO is doing is really, how does it go together with everything else we're doing? For example, when it comes to gender equality, that was one of the things I talked about yesterday. We have the 1325 resolution. Can we make the world a more secure and peaceful place if we think about gender equality also within NATO? And I say yes to that question. And I think NATO can and should do a lot better when it comes to gender equality. I think when we just look at history and look at the examples that we have seen, is that when we have women around the table in all offices, also in security and defense, we get different solutions, different questions are asked, and the results are better.
So I want to pick on that. There's a UN resolution 1325, which really focuses on women in conflict and post-conflict situations. Are there lessons learned from implementing the resolution that we can apply to maybe a broader context in terms of bringing women to the table?
Well, I'm very proud to say that Iceland has been on top of the list when it comes to gender equality, the top of the list of the World Economic Forum, now for 9 consecutive years. And a lot of people come to me, foreign media, and ask, okay, isn't Iceland just paradise on earth for women? And I always say, no, definitely not, you know. I'm Prime Minister number 2 that is a woman. When we have Prime Minister, maybe 30 Prime Ministers who have been women, I can say that we have really reached gender equality. So there's a lot of work to be done also in Iceland. And what we have learned, however, from all this is that when we think about things from the aspect of gender equality, for example, when you're in a conflict-ridden area and think about the role of women and families, you take a different take than when you're just looking at it with the glasses of the conflict, really. And that applies for every sector in life. You get a different education system, different health system, if you always have the gender glasses and put them on regularly.
So does your government regularly put the gender glasses on as you're sending people to the NATO headquarters?
Absolutely. And as I said yesterday, gender equality shouldn't be something that you talk about when you have spoken about all the serious business, when you have spoken about security and military spending, and then we're going to talk about gender equality later in a side room. You have to have it always there. You have to have it as an underlying thought in everything you do and say.
Yeah.
And, you know, we are working on that with our government, not only when it comes to defense, but in all sectors of society.
Okay. I want to pick on another SDG, number 16, which talks about sort of justice and sort of institutions. institutions have been really, sort of multilateral institutions have been under stress and really been challenged. The system, the rule of law has been challenged. Partnership has been challenged. Where is Iceland on this? And do you have some novel sort of new ways of maybe sort of addressing some of these sort of challenges for these institutions that we can sort of move forward, kind of doing things differently? I think one of the words that comes to my mind, having read about you, is, you know, you want to do things new. I mean, there's new ways of doing things or creating new institutions, but how can we ensure that the rule of law is really being upheld and that people have a place to go and ask for justice?
Well, all politicians think they're doing something new, so that's nothing new about that, but it's a common factor for us. But why is it important that we have international institutions, that we are always thinking about the rule of law, that international law should be followed and obeyed? Well, for a small country like Iceland, we are 350,000 people. We really have learned that how important the rule of law, that international law should be obeyed, is. And this is maybe, I don't know, coming from a small country and only knowing that view of the world, I don't know if it's as important maybe for the really big countries, but for us, we gained independence in 1944. And became a republic then. So for us, these mechanisms, these structures are highly important because they ensure that all countries, small and big, can actually survive, can actually make their points and have something to say really about how the world is run. So that's why we, wherever we go, stress this item. And this is, of course, part of the SDGs, that we have institutions that are working transparently, that are democratic, and that are following the international law. So I don't think this is a novel idea, actually, but I think in this world we're living in now, where maybe increasingly complex challenges, I think this cannot be stressed enough.
Yeah, thank you. I want to ask you one more question, but I also want to make sure that our audience gets ready. I want to give you a chance to ask your questions to the Prime Minister. I know climate environment is very important to Iceland, and you personally coming from a Green Party. Is there anything that NATO and the UN can do together to be a bit more preemptive in terms of when it comes to potential crises and disasters?
Well, climate change is definitely a key factor when it comes to global security, because what we probably will see is we are going to see more migration, we are going to see more social instability because of climate change. And personally, I think this is the biggest challenge we are facing now, how we are going to react to climate change. And I also think that if everybody really must participate, we have put forward an ambitious goal in Iceland to become carbon neutral. So we're not only reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, but we're also planning to increase carbon binding, for example, by growing forests, restoring wetlands, etc. And we can't do this just the government or just the individual. We have to have the local communities, we have to have the private sector, we have to have the individuals, we have to have everybody on the team. And that's why you ask, can NATO do anything? NATO must do something, because we all have to deliver our share for this important project, which really revolves around that we all need to head for carbon neutrality.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's a very important thing, and in spite of, we all have different goals and aims, running private companies, running this alliance or whatever, this must be our common goal.
Yeah, it's actually a very important point, bringing the private sector in and sort of the security, also how maybe we can sort of think about preemptiveness, but also the environment and the climate.
And I think also, you know, the private sector actually coming in really forcefully now into the climate discussion, and I think this is going to be maybe the most important thing to do something about it, seeing all those big companies really making a real change in their operation.
Yeah, thank you. Let me open it up to you. We have a question here. There's a question there. Could I have microphones? Please, this gentleman up here front, in the front.
Thank you very much. It was a good presentation that you did, and putting your glasses gender quality. I would like to know what you think that was the most important in the declaration of this NATO summit to your country, to the maritime routes that are near Iceland, and the problems of security in this high north. So I would like what you could underline as the most important in this declaration. It is a declaration of 79 points. So it was a very consensual declaration. So what is the most important there? Not only the gender equality and the environment, but related to security, what was the most important in this declaration to you? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Do you want to respond?
Well, it's always difficult to make a choice, as you mentioned, with so many points in this declaration. But I would like to mention two things. One that I personally think is very important and that we talked about also in last evening's, during last evening's dinner, and that's the goal for disarmament and nuclear proliferation. Hopefully we are going to see some positive developments there in North Korea, in the Korean Peninsula, but also within NATO. And Iceland is actually hosting a conference this autumn about disarmament, and this is an issue we put very high on the agenda. And the other point I would like to mention, which is something that Iceland really needs to focus on and is part of the declaration, and that is cybersecurity. And that's something that we have been analyzing in our country, realizing really how vulnerable the modern society is when it comes to cyber threats, realizing how dependent we are when it comes to our information IT systems. So I think that's one of the key points in the declaration, and this is something that we want to work closely with other nations in building up our cybersecurity.
Okay, two very important issues again, sort of the nuclear and sort of the cyber, the new threat. We have a question over there.
Thank you.
Can you please introduce yourself?
Certainly. Ulrike Franke, I work at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and I'm also a member of WIIS UK. Iceland is very different from almost any other country. I mean, not the least geographically. You're an island, you're far removed from everyone. I was wondering, how difficult is it for you to explain to your population how important it is, or that it is important to be member of alliances, member of the international community, engaged, all of that? Do the Icelandic people have a special view on that?
Well, that's a very good question. And I would like to answer it because before I became a politician, I taught Icelandic literature. And when you look at Iceland's history ever since Iceland was settled, and we are definitely, far away. I don't know why I did bring the talking points, but it's good to have them though. I'm just going to put them there. We were settled in 874, and we're definitely out on the periphery. We're very far away, mainly by Norwegians and people from the British Isles. And ever since that moment, Iceland has been constantly in collaboration and cooperation with other nations. And I think maybe just because we're an island out on the periphery, the Icelandic public has always been very conscious about the importance of international cooperation. Icelandic poets wrote their poetry, and then they said, okay, what am I going to do with this? I'm going to go to the Norwegian king and recite it to him, because I need new audiences. And this is what we've been doing forever. We've been traveling around the world talking to new audiences. So it's maybe partly because we're an island, we have always been very much focused on international cooperation. And as I said before, being a small country, we are really dependent on the rule of law, that international law is obeyed, and that's why multilateral institutions matter very much to us. For us, being a nation of 350,000, and I will just be very frank, this is something that we don't like to admit to ourselves. It's often more difficult for us to have a bilateral communications with other bigger nations, And that's why multilateral organizations are very important to Iceland, because there we actually find this audience we've been striving for ever since the early 900s.
Yeah. No, thank you very much for bringing the population and the people with it. And you made another really wonderful plug about partnerships. We have one question over there, please.
Good morning. I'm Elena Todorova from Bulgaria, Vice President of ATA, the Atlantic Treaty Association, and also of the Bulgarian Atlantic Club. Madam Prime Minister, you would bear with me for one introductory remark having to do with our hostess this morning. I really need to commend Women in International Security. While I was serving in Washington for a total of almost 13 years, I engaged a lot with this organization, and I'm happy to see that it's gaining more ground and more vigor. Obviously, I need to re-engage again today. But it's in this particular context that I would like to share something with you, Madam Prime Minister. You and I come from two opposite ends of Europe, and definitely we live in different cultures. My culture, for good or for worse, is more kind of a macho culture, historically, traditionally. It's changing very, very quickly. But obviously the military is a domain, an area which is still very much a man's world. And I was wondering, although again, I say it's changing, it would be unfair to neglect the changes that have happened, especially after our NATO membership. But I was wondering, do you have any instances of, how should I put it nicely, Me Too in your military? Do you have a second rating of good women who can serve on an equal footing with men, but they're somehow given more time to ripe, to mature? So how would you describe the situation in your country from that perspective? Thank you.
Thank you for making the plug for WIIS. I do want to remember Iceland does not have a standing army, but you have coast guards, you have people
don't have a military. We have police, we have coast guards.
Exactly.
So our efforts for NATO, for example, are all on a civilian basis. But well, it's a good question because obviously we had a lot of Me Too histories. It was quite something in Iceland, and because I mentioned we were at the top of the global gender gap list, that list doesn't measure gender-based violence, and that's why gender-based violence is really one of the priorities of my government. And it's definitely something that we see that there's a great difference, even though I can't talk about any military in Iceland, there's a great difference between different sectors. And I can imagine that within the military, which is, as you say, more dominated probably by macho culture than many other sectors, you would have such histories. The most striking histories, however, in Iceland, in the Me Too wave, were not connected to police or Coast Guard or anything like that. They were connected to immigrant women, who also were not only women, but also had a difficult social standing. So that was the most vulnerable group when it came to the Me Too histories in Iceland. So it wasn't really sector-based. It was more the origins and the social status that you could say was the decisive factor there.
Do you want to talk a little bit about how you've addressed it, or how has Iceland come together behind that?
Well, sometimes it is good to be small, because when something happens in Iceland, you can somehow deal with it very quickly. So what has happened in Iceland is actually that government, institutions, private sector, we have all been together to talk about how we are going to react. We are all making plans on how to deal with Me Too and how to deal with gender-based violence. We are focusing on it from the judiciary system, from the health system, from the education system. So we're actually making a holistic plan how we can really eradicate gender-based violence.
Okay, so it's a multi-pronged approach.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And as I said, the Icelandic way, because we're so small, so everybody is always participating in everything. It's a little bit... I'm actually an expert in crime fiction, and I was once asked, how is it possible to write crime fiction in Iceland? Because everybody knows everybody. So maybe that's also good for our security, because we all know everybody. Yeah. So that's maybe an asset too.
Yeah, it's another way of inclusive security.
Yeah, you could say that.
Thank you.
I don't know if it's allowed to make jokes at such a serious convention.
I have one more question here, and then let's see how we do with time to take two more. Please, the microphone.
Yes, thank you, Richard Scholes, MP from Latvia. Well, it's great to see a young leader and leading a very innovative country, Iceland. And I think we can take a lot from Iceland in terms of long-term planning. Fine example is football, national football team. I mean, what you have pulled off
Thank
for
you
the
for
past
mentioning that. Thank you.
2 years, it's really amazing. With a population of 370,000, it's really amazing. But I would like to ask you two questions. One is connected with cybersecurity. One is that, you know, of course, I understand you are not about, you know, army physical defense, but cybersecurity, they don't have borders. I mean, cyberspace and all that. And knowing that Iceland has become a hub for various actors in cyberspace, either for ill or for good. So what would be Iceland's stance in the long term in actually shaping the security in the cyberspace area? And second question, which I think is very interesting, and I would love to hear your insights, since you mentioned it's your first summit, NATO Summit. What are your takes from last night's dinner, the private one part, from the leaders' dinner?
Okay.
Two very good questions. Thank you.
Well, first about cybersecurity.
If you want to stand up, then you can address him and don't awkwardly turn and...
First about cybersecurity. Well, cybersecurity is, you know, it's a very diverse issue. We can talk about cyber attacks, and we've had our share of that. We, you know, our national public radio was, for example, received a cyber attack, and several official or public institutions have been experiencing that. So that's one thing that we need to be very mindful of. But cybersecurity is also about how, for example, we are seeing the spread of fake news and all sorts of non-facts being spread around social media. And one of the things that we have discovered, because we've been analyzing this, we've been working with the UK actually, and analyzing the situation in Iceland, is that the consciousness of Icelanders, you know, partly because we are so few, we are very relaxed about what we're doing on the internet. So we just do everything, and we are never worried about it. So all our information is really there. So this is something that we need to do something about. But at the same time, because you mentioned that we have become a hub for several actors, we want to be a leading country when it comes to freedom of information, freedom of expression. So these two goals are difficult to match. And this is actually one of my priorities in my ministry, the Prime Ministry. That's really writing a new law on information, guaranteeing that freedom of information and freedom of expression, but still raising at the same time raising the consciousness of the Icelandic people about internet and information, and also ensuring the cybersecurity of all our important institutions. Because what we've seen is that you can actually just disable the whole healthcare system by a cyber attack, for example. And as I said, we have become so dependent on it. Yeah. The second question, the dinner. Russia. Well, I think I'm not allowed to say anything. But I could say that I thought it was interesting being here for the first time, feeling the great tension before the meeting and the dinner, and then experiencing much less tension in the meeting and in the dinner than in the media. So that was one of the things I found really interesting, because if you look at the media, you would have thought that everybody would have been just like going crazy in the meetings and in the dinner, but it wasn't, definitely not like that. So that was quite an experience for me. The meeting yesterday, we talked a lot about, and I mentioned disarmament and nuclear proliferation, and that was one of the key topics, for example, at the dinner yesterday. And hopefully we will see something good coming out of that.
Yeah, thank you. That's very reassuring. I think we have time for one more question. Could we have a microphone up front? please
Thank
introduce
you.
yourself.
I'm Tobias Lindner. I'm the defense policy spokesperson of the Green Party in the German parliament.
Okay.
And I share your view that we need to get a wider understanding what is security, and not that it's not only military. How easy or how hard is it to convince your allies in the alliance that they share this view, especially when it comes to spending?
Well, I'm not saying that, you know, I didn't feel that everybody agreed with me. I can tell you that. But I think it's problematic talking about security differently. And I think for me, coming from the political direction I come from, it's my duty to do that, to talk about security differently. And even though I can tell you that not many other leaders were talking in the same direction I was talking, I also got a positive feedback. And I'm still in politics. I've been in the Icelandic parliament for 10 years now because I'm a mindless optimist. So I really believe that, I believe in dialogue. I believe that it works in the end. So I'm just going to continue talking, even though it might take some time. But of course, definitely not everybody agrees. And this view on security, I personally think this is the view of the future. I think we need to look at security holistically. I think we need to look at it that we want to prevent conflict and not just stepping in when conflict has happened. And we do that, for example, by implementing the SDGs, by thinking about equality, by thinking about peaceful institutions, the rule of international law and order, thinking about environment and gender equality. I think all these issues are also security issues.
Yeah. Thank you. It's a wonderful way to tie it back actually to the title of our event, NATO Engages. It's about the partnership. It's about the sort of different takes on security. So thank you for bringing this message forward, and I encourage all of you, all of us, to keep on saying this. Are there any final words, things you would like to say that you haven't been able to address?
No, just saying that this summit will be a chapter in my biography, and it will be an interesting chapter.
Please join me in thanking the Prime Minister for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And I give the word, as we walk out, I give the word to my dear colleague Ian Lesser, Vice President from the German Marshall Fund, to introduce the next session.
Thank you.
Please.
Minister.